In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to be interacting with Chris's rebuttal to my opening statement. I doubt that I'm going to be able to fit it into 10 minutes, so it might bleed into my my closing statement, but I'll do what I can. I'm going to start with this. Chris is really having a hard time understanding something, and quite frankly, I have a hard time. I really don't think that I'm going to convince Chris of something. I don't think that he's going to understand something. So I'm going to hopefully straighten something out for you, the viewer. And what it is this. There's a number of times that Chris brings up the passages that I employ, the passages that I call on, in a way as to refute God's sovereignty. Listen, Chris is saying this. John is bringing up these verses in a way as to say that God is not sovereign. That's not the case. Similarly, it's not the case to say that, look here we have a time where it's demonstrated that people are doing something that's not the will of God, therefore God is not sovereign in that time. Listen, my position has never been that of trying to refute God's sovereignty. Rather, it is that of defining his sovereignty. Chris and I agree with something, and it is the reality that God is sovereign. And I've said this a number of times. I could probably say it 5, 10 times. Chris probably won't understand this. God is sovereign. The question is this: how is God sovereign? Okay. Now, there's a number of times when he brings up, he brings up some passages like Psalm chapter 103 and Daniel 4, where it says that God rules over the earth. And God is sovereign over everything. And also he brings up passages in Exodus where God determines that people break his commands. And he brings up these passages in a way as if they are the death knell of my position. And as a matter of fact, in his rebuttal of my position, he says that a lot of his opponents just simply do not address those passages. You see, rhetoric isn't going to deal with it. You've got to deal with the passages. You've got to answer the passages. Well, I have no problem answering the passages. I have no problem dealing with those passages. The reality of the matter is that there is not a single passage that Chris has brought up that throws a curveball into my framework or my understanding of God's sovereignty. And it doesn't challenge me one bit at all. What do I say to passages that say that God rules over all the earth? God is sovereign over everything. You know what I say to those things? Amen. God is sovereign. God rules over the earth. I affirm that. I celebrate it. Okay? What do I do when I see that that God decrees certain things to happen? I affirm it. What is a person to do with that? I say, amen. God be God. God is sovereign. God can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants to do it. I've said that before. Now, here's the thing. I just read them and accept them for what they are. However, one of the things that I don't do is this. I don't see that decreeing there, and I don't take that decree and blanket it to everything. Let it be known this. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that God decrees everything. He doesn't decree everything. On the contrary, what it does say, there are places in the Bible that says that certain things happen that are not his expressed will. Okay? That's why the passages that I bring up not to, quote-unquote, refute the sovereignty of God. It's rather to understand how God exercises his sovereignty. Okay? Because it's his sovereign choice to do some things, to determine certain things. It's his sovereign choice to allow certain things. That, my friends, is the potter's freedom. Okay? That's the potter's freedom. Now, what's he say about this? Jeremiah, for example. He says, now he brings up this whole command, his commands and his decree, that there are things that God commands and there are things that God decrees. And commenting on that, he says that in the passage in Jeremiah that I bring up, that he says they did, when we're talking about them offering up their children to idols, they're burning their children as sacrifices. God says, I never commanded that, nor did it come into my mind. So he says they did act They did not, this is what Chris says, they did not act according to his will of command, but they did act according to his will of decree. Oh, really? How convenient. Oh, so Chris is saying that they acted according to his decree, that God decreed that? Listen, read the passage for yourself and see if you see that anywhere in there. You see, here's the deal. It's not there. It's not there. If you want it there, you have to import it. You have to read it into the passage because it's just not there. That's what Chris has to do in a number of different places. He has to import it in there because, listen, it's clear in passages that he decrees certain things. It's clear in other passages that there is no decreeing there. What does that leave us with? It means that both happens. There are some things that he decrees, and there are some things that he allows. Okay? It's a paradox there. That's what it is. It's acknowledging both, right? Then he goes on and says that because there's no mention of a decree there, that it's really not even applicable it's not relevant to our matter, to the debate, because it doesn't talk about God's sovereignty. You see, here's the problem. Chris equates decreeing with sovereignty. To be sovereign is to decree. They're inseparable in his mind. And I'm telling you, it's not true. That's not the case. God can be sovereign and decree certain things, and he can allow certain things. Again, that's the potter's freedom. I want to send that to Dr. White. So then he brings up this. Oh, I wish I had more time for this. In speaking of the Lord's Prayer, he says this. By the way, I can't comment all on what he says on the Lord's Prayer. I want to encourage anybody who is up for this to rewatch his segment and listen carefully to what he says about the Lord's Prayer. It's mind-numbing stuff. It's just like amazing. I don't know if I can decipher through it. It's just an absolute mess. It's a mess. But here's just a snippet of it. This passage. Let's see. Here he goes. I freely agree and admit that God's will of command is not being done on earth. So we're talking about God's commanded will. God, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He says, okay. He says, hey, I agree and admit that God's will of command is not being done on earth. That's why people are sinners. That's why people are breaking and violating his commands every day and every moment. Oh, is that it? Is that why? Is it because they're not accomplishing his commanded will? No, listen, according to your position, isn't it because he decreed it? That's why he decreed that it wouldn't happen. This is already said and done. Asking and petitioning for his will to be done on earth as in heaven is all a moot point. It's an exercise in futility because nothing is going to change. And that's exactly what Chris says in the answers to the 5 questions that I posed to him. Prayer doesn't change anything. Praying that prayer is absolutely useless. Okay? So, again, he says, in his answer to this, basically, he doesn't deal with that verse at all. He doesn't deal with Jeremiah. He says that it doesn't deal with God's sovereignty. In answer to the Lord's Prayer, again, he says that this doesn't deal with God's sovereignty. He says his answer to that is, hey, God sovereignly rules over all. God sovereignly rules over all, which I affirm. He does. He rules over all. Then, commenting on Matthew 23, he brings this up. He says, okay, well, so John brings this up, or people will bring this up to say that people did their will, so God's sovereignty isn't at work. That's what he says. He misrepresents the position. I never said that God's sovereignty wasn't at work there. I simply mentioned that God sovereignly allowed them to do those things. And again, he says that this isn't relevant to the discussion. Listen, a person can bury their head in the sand and pretend that it doesn't have anything to do with it, but it has everything to do with it. This is a primary verse. This is an explicit primary verse concerning all 3 of them. He said they're not primary verses. They are primary verses dealing exactly with the sovereignty of God. They're to the core of it because it explains and gives us the framework of what is included in God's sovereignty. It's a matter of how God exercises his sovereignty. God is sovereign. God rules over all. God determines certain things to happen, and clearly he allows other things to happen without his direct intervention. I'm going to have to pick it up in the closing.